Fortune, fellow directors, members of the media. Good afternoon. My name is Aisha Wharton, and I am the director of the CARICOM and Caribbean Affairs Division. Welcome to today's press conference, which has been called to share some information on the Guyana-Venezuela border dispute, which is a matter of national and regional concern. I now invite Minister Brown to address you.
Good afternoon, Permanent Secretary, Deputy Permanent Secretaries of the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, Director Wharton, other members of staff, members of the media, national audience and viewing public of Trinidad and Tobago. Greetings to all of you. It's a matter of public awareness that Prime Minister Dr. the Honorable Keith Rowley led a delegation to St. Vincent and the Grenadines yesterday, leaving Trinidad and Tobago early yesterday morning and returning quite late last night after participating in and contributing to a very important event of CARICOM activity. But before I begin a presentation on what transpired in St. Vincent yesterday, I want to take you back to the year 2021. And at the beginning of that year, Prime Minister Rowley had fallen ill and was at West Shore Hospital and had some cardiac concerns. And all of you in the media reported that Dr. Rowley's first act upon resuming work after being discharged after his cardiac tests and interventions was to chair a meeting of CARICOM as the new chairman of CARICOM, which occurred the beginning of January 2021. That meeting was convened and released a statement under the hand of Dr. Rowley, statement by the Caribbean community on the Guyana-Venezuela border controversy. And I want to just give you a few elements of that statement because it's very relevant to the build-up to yesterday's intervention. This is what it said, 12th January 2021. The Caribbean community is deeply disappointed and concerned at the decree and subsequent statements by Venezuela with respect to that country's border controversy with Guyana, including intimations of the creation of a strategic area of national development called Territory for the Development of the Atlantic Facade. The Caribbean community is in full support of the judicial process underway at the ICJ, which is intended to bring a peaceful and definitive end to the long-standing controversy between those two countries. CARICOM reiterates in the strongest possible terms its full and unswerving support for the maintenance and preservation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Guyana. CARICOM firmly repudiates any acts of aggression by Venezuela against Guyana. 12th January 2021. Meeting chaired by our Prime Minister, Dr. Rowley. So when I heard interventions in recent weeks aimed to suggest that Dr. Rowley is disconnected or uninvolved or somehow distant from these matters, that is absolutely not the case. Now, since then, between 2021 and 2023, CARICOM has focused consistently on this matter and has communicated consistently with the regional public. And there was statement after statement issued, many meetings at which these matters were discussed with the full participation and contribution of Guyana, and always with the full participation and I dare say leadership in many ways, of CARICOM's discussions by Trinidad and Tobago in the form of our Prime Minister. That should come as no surprise to any member of the national community, because Trinidad and Tobago was the birthplace of CARICOM. And Trinidad and Tobago was the site of our recent 50th anniversary celebrations. And I reference those celebrations because that was an opportunity for all of the leadership of this family to gather, and they came here to introspect, to reflect, and to recommit to regional solidarity. And it is my view that that ethos and the culmination of those efforts has helped to steer us through some very recent challenges and helped to produce the types of results that we were able to extract yesterday in the midst of a very challenging circumstance. So I just want to anchor this discourse and start with the treatment of Dr. Rowley's nexus and leadership in that regard. And I want to take you now to yesterday's event. The meeting occurred at the airport in St. Vincent at the diplomatic lounge. And we arrived, we had some time waiting because delegations arrived at different points. A few of them were there from the night before. Prime Minister decided we will go on the morning and leave at night so that it would not incur hotel costs and other considerations. And we started with a core meeting of CARICOM. CARICOM only in the room. Prime Minister, it was determined, Prime Ministers plus one, Ministers of Foreign Affairs, gathered in a room, examined the landscape, look at a summary of the emergency meeting that was held last week, Friday, and strategize on how the day would flow. We also examined a draft declaration, a few elements of what we would have hoped would be the declaration to come out of the day's work. So we determined that the President of Guyana would be invited to come in. He was not part of this initial introductory meeting. He'd be invited to come in, do a brief presentation, respond to questions, and participate in discussion. He and his delegation would then leave the room. Then the President of Venezuela would be invited to come in with his delegation. A similar discussion, presentation, response to questions. And then the moment many would have been waiting for would occur when both leaders would come into the same space together and would sit face to face for a direct interaction with the participation of that same gathering around the table. So that is how we embarked on the work of the day. Again, I have to emphasize, because of some things that are special about Trinidad and Tobago, that Prime Minister Rowley was part and parcel of these discussions, the strategy, the leadership, the steering of how this thing went. So President Ali came in with a sizable team. He stated Guyana's position, which is familiar to us and well known to CARICOM and endorsed by CARICOM. He indicated certain areas that Guyana would be unyielding on, and there was a sense of flexibility on some other aspects, which we took note of and took into consideration. Similar occurred when President Maduro came into the room with his team. There was discussion, questions around the table, some analysis took place, and identification of some potential for a shaping of a joint declaration. And then the two leaders were invited to come into the space together. They had an initial interaction, and let's be frank, I know there was some coverage of that moment, a bit of an awkward direct introduction to each other. You know what I'm talking. There was some awkwardness. There was some a lack of warmth, and that was a reflection of the proceeds of the last few months and weeks. And then they sat at a table narrower than this one, considerably narrower, so directly face to face. This is how the room was set up for this. And again, President Ali was given the opportunity to make some opening statements, which he did. President Maduro was given the opportunity to make some opening statements, which he did in his own style and manner. And then there was an exchange, largely informed by the gathered heads, the prime ministers of our region, intervening, asking questions of both leaders, making suggestions, and what emerged was an interactive discussion. And as that proceeded throughout the day, and you're talking about many hours in what I've summarized, the mood in the room began to lighten to some extent. And by the end of those interactions, there was another greeting exchange between the two principal parties involved, President Ali and President Maduro. And you could see some progress. There was more warmth, there was a genuine exchange and several handshakes, and there was some more comfort. What we were able to emerge with, and I want to state clearly my position, that what occurred yesterday was a seminal moment in the history of the Caribbean community. And I want to underscore the reality that there were several observers in the room for that face-to-face meeting, including as observers, the chef de cabinet of the United Nations Secretary General was present, as well as an assistant Secretary General, an Under Secretary General of the United Nations, came to St. Vincent to be an observer. President Maduro also brought with him, as part of his team, 2 Latin American diplomats in the form of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Colombia and the Vice Minister of Honduras. So they were also present. And additionally, we had very senior diplomat from Brazil, the personal envoy and special advisor to President Lula. They were present during the face-to-face component. And they made, particularly the Brazilian, made certain interventions. And one of their remarks is that what was taking place in that room was quite unusual, where to diffuse tension and to respond to an escalating crisis, leadership within the region was able to respond and seek to treat effectively with the circumstance. This really was identified as a point of pride for CARICOM and an example. Sometimes we take example from our European friends and other parts of the world, but this was a case of us, our regional family, setting an example for the rest of the world. And maybe if this formula were deployed a little more frequently, where it may not be a case of negotiation and you have some very hard issues in front of you, but an opportunity for dialogue, conflict can be avoided in certain circumstances. And I wouldn't give examples of ongoing conflicts because they are in the news or national news every night, international news every day. But the principle is an important one. So this is what CARICOM embarked upon. I would want to say under the leadership of the current chairman, Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit of Dominica, and the dean, as it were, the most senior of the senior, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves, who currently is the pro tempore president of CELAC. CELAC is a larger regional organization which includes much of the membership of CARICOM, but also includes Central and South America, and hence Brazil, Venezuela is a member of CELAC as well. So these were the entities, those were the agencies under which the invitations went out, the meeting was convened, and I already gave you a sense of the leadership around the room. In addition to Prime Minister Rowley, we had the Prime Ministers of the Bahamas, Barbados, Grenada, St. Lucia, St. Kitts, and Nevis as well. And what emerged was a joint declaration. So let me give you one last component. So after these discussions occurred, the face-to-face occurred, the distillation of the key elements of a joint declaration that could be, were likely to be agreed upon, a small drafting team was identified to work on the declaration. And that is where Minister of Energy and the Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister, Stuart Young, was pulled in, several others, a Guyanese representative, Prime Minister Mia Mottley was a part of that wordsmithing and drafting group to really work on shaping the declaration further, which was then presented to each delegation. They did some further work on their own. We identified the common areas that were easy to agree upon. The chapeau of the document was fairly easy because it was founded on language that we have been using for some time. And I noted that when President Ali arrived in St. Vincent, he had an interaction with the media, and he began by using a phrase that we've used in this country, Prime Minister Rowley has used consistently, the theme of maintaining a zone of peace in the Caribbean. And I took note that when President Maduro himself spoke to the media on arrival, before the meeting began, he also used the same phrase as an anchor for his approach to the discussion. So I took careful note of that. And sometimes we make light of these principles, or we think it's just talk. But that's an important frame of reference that helps steer us to some consensus and a true sense of progress. So we ended up with a draft declaration, which was the product of a lot of work and a lot of solidarity and leadership within CARICOM. And I've prepared a handout which we've circulated. P.S. We've circulated the handout, or we will circulate very shortly, just to make your job and maybe my job today a little bit easier, summarizing key elements of the declaration. One of the major issues that Guyana brought into the room was this sense of fear, this sense of an impending crisis or military conflict or invasion that people in the Essequibo and other parts of the country and even in the region were beginning to experience. That was directly addressed in the joint declaration. Another tricky area was the lack of consonance around the ICJ. Guyana has firmly rooted its current approach in the jurisdiction, the identified jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice in the route to a solution to this controversy and an examination of that 1899 arbitral award. Venezuela has a very different view. In the end, CARICOM leaders and other participants were able to identify a formula of wording in a joint declaration agreed by both sides that captured the essence of both positions and have codified that as Guyana's assertion as well as Venezuela's association. One important point of unity between the two sides was a continued reference to the critical importance of the Geneva Agreement of 1966. And maybe in a future discourse, we can go into some more details on that. and the potential role of that agreement in the next steps and the future, let's say after the ICJ makes its final judgment. There's some potential there. So the issue of threats of force or the actual use of force have been addressed in this joint declaration, agreed to by the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The issue of the theme of good neighborliness and peaceful coexistence was also identified very clearly. There was a mechanism identified for if there's an incident, which remains quite possible. Something had happened at sea, something had happened on the land. You can have a uniformed officer with some exuberance on either side. And given the circumstances before yesterday, that could have been a flashpoint for something worse. That was taken into consideration in yesterday's work by our leaders, and you would see it clearly identified in Clause 6. There is a mechanism whereby the two states, if there is such a flashpoint or any incident that can lead to tension, the two states would immediately engage in communication between each other. They would immediately communicate with CARICOM and with CELAC and with President Lula. So those are immediate triggers if there is such an incident that has been observed by either side. Very importantly, there was also agreement to establish a joint commission of technical persons and the two foreign ministers to address some more circumstantial matters, and some examples were identified, recognizing that even though the border controversy itself is not the subject of bilateral negotiations, it would be important to keep this more positive spirit alive, that the two sides engage in dialogue on matters that they can discuss. And issues like food security and agriculture, fisheries with some provisos, and other sectors that can and should be discussed between neighboring states at all times were identified as potential areas of focus of this joint commission. So that was another important achievement, and both sides accepted the importance of those engagements. And then, because the leadership of CARICOM and CELAC exist on a rotational basis, and because Guyana is due to be the next chairman of the Caribbean Community from January 1st, 2024, it was recognized as important that Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves, well, let me start with Skerrit, Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit, be maintained as a lead on this issue and in follow-up to this declaration, even beyond the end of his chairmanship at the end of this month. Of course, Guyana and President Ali would chair CARICOM in its discussions and treatment of all other issues that would be before the community. So that is worth noting as well. And then, because of the key role of Ralph Gonsalves, his seniority, and the fact that he has used his good offices as president of CELAC in this manner, it was deemed important that even with CELAC, when St. Vincent and the Grenadines is no longer the pro tempore president, Prime Minister Gonsalves would retain a role in steering this matter moving forward as well. And that is codified within this joint declaration. So those were some important and forward-leaning ideas and initiatives which succeeded in being codified into the joint declaration, really benefiting from a lot of the wisdom and leadership within the room. We also agreed on a venue, because I remember a question coming from the media in the build-up to the meeting. I did a round of the morning programs and so on. One of the questions was, what would come next? What would happen? So you meet, you talk, they fight and shout, or something works out well. What next? That was taken into consideration. So there's agreement to meet again in Brazil within the next 3 months for a further edition of this kind of exchange, interpersonal, direct, in the presence of your peers, with the support of the regional family and the full involvement of CARICOM. So that is also agreed upon, that within 3 months there will be further direct meeting between the states and continued discussion. And then there was recognition of the very important role of St. Vincent and the Grenadines in hosting this meeting at very short order and mobilizing logistics that created an atmosphere conducive to progress and some degree of success. That was really critical. So as I speak to you today, I can say that expectations were exceeded. Now, expectations were low, but those expectations were exceeded. And I would want to credit our regional family. I said at the beginning, this was a key moment for CARICOM to shine. I believe we've reaped the fruits of some of the efforts of the past, where we worked together through COVID-19. Trinidad and Tobago had its chairmanship during that period. We shared technical expertise, we shared vaccines, we negotiated together with the African Union and other external parties and partners. And there was a sense that CARICOM was rising. And then we gathered here for our 50th anniversary celebrations, and there was a real sense of solidarity. And it is my belief that that ethos has helped us through this challenge, this ongoing challenge, and has produced results that everyone was quite pleased. And both leaders at the core of it said that they were pleased that they participated, that they gave this process a chance, and are hoping that this would lead to our maintenance of the Caribbean Sea as a zone of peace. So I wanted to take you through some of those experiences, my own experience as a fairly young minister in the room during that process, observing our leader and the region's leaders really working together in the best interest of the people of the Caribbean. So today, last night, today, people in Essequibo, people in Georgetown, in Guyana, and others, even here there was talk about, concern, worry. I have family there, we have students there, we have staff there. There is some degree of relief, a sense of a reduction in fear. That sense of an impending calamity has been ameliorated to some extent. A lot now depends on the disposition and communication and conduct of these two leaders in the days and weeks to come. But even that was addressed, where there was identification and commitment to avoid, in word or deed, to refrain from any escalation of conflict or disagreement arising from any controversy between them. That's important language, and really seeks to rule out the addition of any fuel to this controversy as we move forward. So this represents important work, and as I said, as one of the participants and part of TNT's delegation, I felt very proud that our regional family has risen to the occasion, and I now open the floor for any questions whatsoever on this issue. Yes, please, if you would be kind enough to reintroduce yourself and pose a question.
Soini Gray from Guardian Media Limited. Thank you so much for that history lesson and reminding us of the Prime Minister's intervention on or comment on the Ghana-Venezuela issue when he was the CARICOM chair. Could you enhance our understanding of how he directly impacted the development of the Argyle Agreement yesterday?
Right, well, it begins really with the meeting last week, Friday, an emergency meeting of heads, a pure caucus where heads only and the Secretary General of CARICOM were in the room. It's by video conference, a virtual space. I wasn't even there. Foreign ministers were not part of that. And that was a reflection of CARICOM's sense of urgency and the sensitivity around those discussions. Prime Minister Rowley was there, participated fully, and we had some exchanges thereafter. It was out of that and those contributions by the region's leaders that this initiative yesterday was designed and occurred. Prime Minister Rowley, again, obviously, was in the room yesterday, along with his peers. And I would say, without exaggeration, took a role of responsibility as one of the senior statesmen in that space to diffuse where there was clear potential for frank disagreement or movement away from consensus. Both him, Prime Minister Motley, Prime Minister Gonzalez, and the others as well, but I'm focusing on your question, really worked very hard throughout the day. I wouldn't tell you what time lunch was had. Very, very, very late. Worked very hard in intense circumstances to achieve this output document, the Declaration of Argyle. So that gives you a sense of Trinidad and Tobago's contribution, but that's in front of the scenes. What I can tell you without fear of contradiction is that behind the scenes, all of these leaders, including our own, have been engaged non-stop in communication via telephone, correspondence, and other means aimed at diffusing tension. There's been a steady stream of communication with President Ali and with President Maduro from across the region. President Lula has been a part of that loop as well, really aimed at reducing tension. So this is still a work in progress, but I feel a sense of comfort that within this region, we have the maturity, we have the experience, the means, the wherewithal, and the technical support as well to have achieved what we did yesterday, and which will see us through the challenges that are to come on this issue and other issues that will confront us.
I also wanted to jump on that comment about the very low expectations of yesterday. And I wondered if it had to do with if there's a concern that President Maduro is not necessarily playing by the same playbook that everyone else is, especially as it relates to diplomacy, especially based on, and thank you for saying this, confirming our perception that there was discomfort between the two, particularly on the Maduro side. He seemed quite a bit sheepish in comparison to Dr. Ali, who was very direct and very stern and very focused in his interactions with his Venezuelan counterpart.
You're referring to before the meeting or during the meeting, those descriptions?
Yeah, I think.
I'm wondering if you were in the room.
I'm talking, but from video of the interactions, the photos, it's very clear that Dr. Ali, as you said, was a very small table, and he's sitting now looking directly at President Maduro, who is occupied with his documents in front and
I
stuff
understand
like that.
The context
Yeah,
now.
but more importantly, that issue of, do you think he's going to adhere to the diplomacy to the agreement, since he seems quite open to not playing by the diplomatic rulebook despite participating in yesterday's meeting?
I will respond in this way. First of all, I would not get involved in any negative descriptives of the participants in that process. And you would understand that as a diplomat myself, and given the sensitivity around what comes next. What I can say is that we shouldn't draw too many conclusions from the very initial period of the meeting when the photographers, videographers, and press would have been in the room. They would have captured just the initial moments and then would have left, and the actual interaction would have begun. So don't read too much into that, who was busy, who was looking at the other. What I can tell you, though, is that I was very impressed with President Ali, who was able to maintain grace and calm under pressure, and President Maduro as well. He has his own style, Latin, and there's usually a lot of drama and flair. And what I found was a degree of respect for the process. And there were some sharp exchanges, as I said, especially in the initial phase. But I felt a sense that there was a genuine commitment to what we were in the room to achieve. And that's the only reason we were able to come out with a consensus document and a declaration. In terms of whether I believe that the agreement will be adhered to, we approach this with the best of intentions, and you're only responsible for things within your control. We're in control of the process and the way in which we undertook it as a regional family. We are not in control of what any president does outside of the process. But those potentials were discussed very frankly. And the tendencies, the domestic factors and pressures were also discussed. And so if there's any departure, especially in language, etc., in the days and weeks, that would be done with full knowledge that the region is aware of what was committed to and is observing behavior and action and language moving forward. So that's what I would say in response to that particular question. Best effort was made, and some would say the best possible result in the circumstances was achieved. This controversy was not solved in St. Vincent yesterday, and it will not go away tomorrow. This long preceded my birth and the birth of anyone in this room. And but we would hope it would come to an end at some point, and just maybe what we've done yesterday would take us a key step in the right direction. Certainly to avoid the worst case scenario, which would be armed conflict in the Caribbean. That's the last thing we want to see between states.
And sorry, I'm going to defer to you, I promise. How about Trinidad's relationship with Venezuela? Of course, you had Prime Minister Rowley and President Maduro in the same space, granted, to talk about the Guyana-Venezuela crisis, but how is Trinidad's relationship with Venezuela at the moment, especially based on this issue?
Yes, Trinidad and Tobago's relationship with Venezuela is nothing new and no secret. It is founded on the mutual interest of both states, as well as on some clear principles. This relationship has been tested on several occasions. It's been tested by incidents that would have occurred over the years with fishermen and other issues. Those were tests. Those principles and this relationship would have been tested due to pressure from overseas. You'd remember the days during the Trump administration when intense pressure was being brought to bear on Venezuela, on who was president and which states in the region was picking and choosing the leader of a foreign country, Venezuela. Trinidad and Tobago stood on its principles then, and that steered us through that very difficult period. And so we find ourselves as a government able to speak to and work with the government of Venezuela very clearly. But if circumstances were different, and I dare say if our leadership was different during those times, I'm not sure how we would even begin to have a conversation. So the point of the matter is, when you stand on principles, it would see you through times of turbulence. And I think that describes our relationship. And even through this and what has happened recently, we are able to discuss, dialogue, negotiate, form agreements, and work with our neighbors in Venezuela, which is essential to our interests as a sovereign nation, but also essential to the management of a difficult maritime border, the sharing of a space where fisheries, vessel movement occurs, search and rescue occurs, and the many other realities that neighboring states have to treat with, trade and other matters. So that's the reality, and as well, as you would know, we have very important economic interests and ties with Guyana. I want to remind you about the Regional Food Security Initiative, which remains a priority of CARICOM. Maybe we don't talk about it as much as we did a year ago, but it remains at the top of the agenda of our regional family, led by the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, in close association with Trinidad and Tobago. So there's a lot at stake here. The nutritional security of the Caribbean community, in some ways, is at stake. The energy security of the Caribbean community. So I would say that sense of responsibility has been imported into these discussions and has led to our leadership maintaining a steady, mature focus on how best these tensions can be reduced, and that to some extent has been achieved. Yes.
Mr. Brown, right. Well, welcome back
Yes,
after your busy...
Everyone knows you, but you can
introduce... Sean Douglas, Newsday. I just had little questions on the follow-up mechanisms, two of the mechanisms looking to the future. One is the ministerial/technocratic commission between Guyana and Venezuela for any little things that may occur. I wondered if there was going to be any third-party input to that, because just in case, or if there's potential, if you leave the door open to anybody, you know, if assistance is required, if there's bilateral talks between, you know, or on the ground, something sort of. And then the other thing would be, if anything happens, there has to be a report into CARICOM, CELAC, and Brazil. And I wondered if there was a need for any coordinating mechanism between these three bodies at all. So that was it.
Yeah, okay, so thank you for the question, Sean. With respect to the commission with the foreign ministers and the technical persons, the idea was to achieve on areas of lower controversy, less controversial matters, achieve bilateral dialogue and even negotiation as far as possible. That doesn't normally involve an observer, a big brother, or an external party in the room. So this would not be focused on the arbitral award. This would not be focused on legal matters around the Geneva Agreement or anything like that. This would be other issues to encourage that exchange, and that joint commission with foreign ministers and technical persons would deem to be useful, and then they would be reporting to their respective heads. So that does not preclude, let's say the commission begins to meet and is not deemed to be functioning well. It would not preclude some re-engineering, but it's deemed that that's a good place to start. to get the two teams together and working on some other matters. And your second question has to do with a coordinating mechanism. Well, at the end of the day, the way it worked here is CARICOM was key. CARICOM is key in all of this. And one of the things, I don't want to get too deeply into the reflections of either of the two principles, but one of the things that President Maduro said, which struck me, was that he is very grateful that there was an opportunity for him to sit and speak to CARICOM, these are his words, on the matters that have been troubling Venezuela, or the perspectives of Venezuela. So there is a recognition. Of course, we recognize ourselves on our role, but Venezuela also has a great degree of regard and recognition for CARICOM, and therefore, if I'm to look for an entity at the core of this as we move forward, CARICOM's role is essential and important.
Brown, 36 News, Minister, just
yes, Mr. Brown.
Some points of clarification, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So at what point would it have been determined by the cabinet led by Prime Minister Dr. Rowley that Trinidad and Tobago should have a delegation at the meeting that occurred in St. Vincent yesterday?
I was aware of that when the Prime Minister informed me and informed the other members of the delegation that we would be joining him in St. Vincent, and we made preparations. Remember, you're talking about the course of less than a week. The emergency meeting was last week, Friday. Invitations would have gone out to President Lula, President Ali, President Maduro. There were a sequence of responses. There was some additional communication mobilized. There was clarification as to who among those principals would be present. In the end, President Lula couldn't make it. But this would not have been achieved if either of those two leaders would not have been in the room. That took some time, and I'm not able to tell you when I began packing my bag or when Minister Young began packing his bag, but we were able to respond to the call of the Prime Minister in joining to support him on this important mission to St. Vincent. Don't know if you got your answer in that, but please.
And also, you mentioned the issue of energy security, food security, and so on. So I think, again, just for clarification, were issues of energy security in any way discussed during the meeting or meetings yesterday? And I ask that because, as everyone knows, Trinidad and Tobago specifically is seeking to finalize the deal, the Dragon Gas deal, and also they're continuing discussions with the Manatee, Lauren Manatee field arrangement. So I'm just wondering, in any of the meetings yesterday, did any issues of energy security, in particular those concerning Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela, or even with Guyana, discussed yesterday?
You know, I could respond very directly. The Dragon Gas scenario and the progress that we've made on that arena was not discussed. That was not the subject of the discussion yesterday at all.
In terms of just general issues, because you did mention it in a general sense of the concern or what could be a concern if there was any sort of further escalation that you said, at least for this time, has been avoided in terms of issues like that, energy security and so on. Is that something that would form part of the concern of Trinidad and Tobago in particular, given the fact that, of course, the Prime Minister was there, you were there, and participated along with Minister Young in those discussions?
Yes, indeed. Well, listen, all of that is connected. I have to take you back to this ethos of maintenance of a zone of peace. If we don't have a zone of peace, none of those activities in pursuit of our development, in pursuit of securing the future of our respective nations can occur. That's the whole point of a Caribbean community and a region that is peaceful, stable, and developing, and able to exploit our potentials and maximize our potentials in the fields that you've referenced, in energy. And again, of course, we focus on our own interests, but we are not the only ones in the region with a need or interest to maximize this theme of energy security. Right across the region, those needs do exist, and that has been part of CARICOM's specific and overt support for Trinidad and Tobago in its negotiations and discussions and dialogue, even with the United States of America. CARICOM has been at our side and in support of us, because we will all benefit from those potentials. It's the same with food security. We will all benefit from a stable, peaceful, functional atmosphere in which those priorities can be properly advanced together. And even in those food security discussions, which occurred in Georgetown, Guyana, and occurred here in Port of Spain at the Agri-Expo and the meetings, that did not exclude Brazil and Venezuela and other neighboring states. All of that has been factored in. So we all have a stake in this.
One other thing, for those of us who are not diplomats and may not understand...
I think you might be a quasi-diplomat, but go ahead.
Diplomatic language. What is the difference between facilitation of talks between parties as opposed to mediation between parties? And what occurred yesterday? What was that? Facilitation
Yes.
or mediation?
Well, it was clearly facilitation, where a framework was identified. Parties were invited to come together to dialogue with each other in an atmosphere conducive to same. And as you know, consensus was arrived at on specific areas which formed a joint declaration. Mediation is a different concept, which involves a mediating party which is unbiased and for which there is consensus from both sides that is our mediator, who would be present and have a specific role in such a process. That approach, which was floated by some divisive stakeholders, was a non-starter. And you'd have noted even Prime Minister Gonzalez at the get-go made it pellucidly clear that he is not a mediator. He has friends in the room. That's not what a mediator does. Trinidad and Tobago. And so even as those suggestions or whatever they were being floated, those protagonists were saying, we have to pick sides. We have to support Guyana as if we weren't. We have to support Guyana directly, and we have to mediate. That's an impossibility. That's a non-starter. It's unintelligent. So I don't want to give too much light, because I think we've already passed that stage of unhelpful and divisive recommendations. But what I would say, based on the exchanges that occurred here, is to reflect a sense of disappointment, because there are opposition forces in all the member states of CARICOM, all opposition parties. And I would say none of them conducted themselves in this atmosphere in the way in which our own opposition did, to seek to really insert itself into a regional scenario in a manner that could be interpreted as very divisive, to try to put Trinidad and Tobago, to really wish that Trinidad and Tobago would be put in an impossible situation. Because what they were calling for is what no member state did, which is to embark on an individual expedition, adventurism. We will do this. We will insert ourselves into this centuries-old controversy and do things like mediate and so on. That did not happen here. This occurred within an institutional framework of CARICOM and CELAC. There was no star boy or star girl. There's a star institution, the Caribbean community. And that's why we were able to achieve some results.
Vivian Bowen, TTT News. Just probably a question for you to expound on. How long or the duration was that interaction between President Maduro and President Ali from Guyana? And also, in all the points of contention, or which one do you think took the longest to iron out?
Well, that's a very good question. I didn't have my stopwatch with me, but I would say the face-to-face interaction that you're referring to was substantial. That would have taken, it's hard for me to say as I was there and, involved in taking notes and passing notes, etc., and rendering support. That occupied a substantial portion of the afternoon. And with respect to the second part of your question.
Which point took the longest to kind of iron out? Or?
Well, some points were not ironed out at all, and therefore didn't find their way into a joint declaration. I would say one of the difficult aspects was the issue of the ICJ itself, the International Court of Justice, and the clear distance between the two sides, which remains, which is identified in this declaration as to the rule of the ICJ. CARICOM has identified a position in that, in identifying with the jurisdiction of the ICJ. Venezuela does not agree. But it took a lot of time hammering back and forth, changes in language, etc. Those of us that have been involved in this process, this type of process, knows it takes a lot of effort to achieve agreement, sometimes on one word, one phrase, one sentence. But what we emerged with, even on that very difficult and potentially divisive issue, was a formula of expression that both sides could agree on, and that in itself is an achievement. So that would be my response as an example of one of the more difficult issues.
Follow up from what you just said, would you care to give an indication of at least one of those challenges that was never resolved?
Well, I don't know if I'd want to import into this dialogue areas that will beyond us. But let me say that the interpretation of the Geneva Agreement is one of those which there are miles of separation. Let me try to give you another example of just sheer distance. The issue of either side having defense exercises with forces from other countries, that emerged in some of the discourse as very contentious and triggering sensitivities on either side. But you're drawing me into details, so I'm just giving you a sense that there were many, many issues that were touched on. There was a shared commitment to focus on those that could help reduce the tension. And those, the distillation of which might increase the tension, were not focused on heavily. And I think that process worked, and if I had to revert a little bit, that is where some of the more senior statesmen in the room came into play significantly.
Thanks for that. Just two more questions. Did the socio-economic situation in Venezuela at all came up any time for discussion in the meeting?
No, that was not discussed. The socioeconomic reality in Venezuela. As I said, there were some exchanges in the initial rounds that may have characterized different realities in either state, but that was not, those attributes and perceptions were not the subject of the discussions yesterday.
Last question here. I know you can correct me if I'm wrong. There might be other, little border conflicts in the region. I think Belize, Guatemala is one.
Yes.
Could you, like if you had to give advice, from something that took place in St. Vincent, if you could give one piece of advice to any other conflict around the world, but in particular the one that might be closer to us?
Well, I wouldn't want to be the one giving the advice. I would say if CARICOM, having taken the steps that we took yesterday and in the build-up to yesterday, is in a position to advise others that it is better to talk than not to talk. It is better to talk than not to talk, even if what has to be discussed, the circumstances may not allow for any examination of the core of a dispute. Talking, simply talking, has value, particularly if there are elements of trust in the space, and if it is done in a framework designed to achieve a positive result. So maybe some of the conflicts, future conflicts, let me not focus on the present one, future conflicts could be avoided if the mature approach of the Caribbean community is applied elsewhere as well.
Minister Brown, final question.
Your final question or for the media group? But proceed.
Very good response. Where was Jamaica in yesterday's meeting, and did they take part in last Friday's meeting of the CARICOM heads on the matter?
To my awareness and my knowledge, Jamaica, as another founding member of the Caribbean community, has been part and parcel of these efforts, part and parcel of the dialogue, the analysis, the recommendations, etc. Jamaica was not present yesterday. I read the list of the heads who were present and who came to St. Vincent to be part of this initiative. Jamaica was one of those, and there are others who did not participate in yesterday's event, but certainly in the emergency meeting and certainly in the work of CARICOM that I've chronicled. We've issued multiple statements over the years. We have shared CARICOM's principles, views, perspectives on this matter. We've had heads of government meetings on which this matter formed part of the agenda at and outside of caucus. Jamaica has been working with the family in that regard. I think you've gotten your answer in there.
Dr. Brown, this is a bit legalistic here, looking at the...
I'll put on my lawyer's hat.
Right, excellent. Right, the Geneva Agreement and then the ICJ's remit.
Yes.
So, looking at the declaration last night, we saw that it stated a support for the Geneva Agreement, but was fairly even-handed on the ICJ, saying, well, Guyana supports ICJ, Venezuela rejects ICJ.
Took note of both positions.
Right, take a note of both positions. The question is, if Venezuela has been going along saying, look, we are for the Geneva Agreement, Guyana has been going along saying, we are for the ICJ, the declaration was, it kind of supported the Geneva Agreement, but was even-handed on the ICJ. What we want to ask, I guess my question would be, what do you understand by the Geneva Agreement, and can it incorporate this ICJ? You know what I'm saying? In other words, yes.
I hear where you're going. I don't think you got it right in your premise, because it is not that Guyana supports the ICJ and not the Geneva Agreement. That's not the Guyanese position at all. The Guyanese position is that we've arrived at the ICJ based on the application of a formula within the Geneva Agreement. Remember that agreement began in 1966. There have been many decades since then, during which negotiations, mixed commission, all those other elements have been deployed. It's Guyana's view, I mean, I don't want to examine the details of each position. It is Guyana's view that those steps have been followed to completion, did not result in a resolution of the controversy, and therefore the steps associated with Article 4 were then initiated. And even where there was disagreement between the two parties as to the next step, the Geneva Agreement takes that into consideration as well. So I'd invite you, Sean, to get a copy, take a look. It's fairly clear. But as in other clear books and documents, subject to varying interpretation. And Venezuela, while it states very clearly that it fully supports the implementation of the Geneva Agreement, has a very different view as to where we are today in that agreement, and are of the view that those bilateral negotiations on the border should continue as at this time. So if you were referring specifically to the fourth paragraph, clause 4, where the joint declaration noted Guyana's assertion that it is committed to the process and procedures of the ICJ for the resolution of the controversy, and noted Venezuela's assertion of its lack of content and lack of recognition of the ICJ. That is a clear and true reflection of its position, which we knew before, that it does not deem itself bound by that judgment whenever it would be handed down. And that's where the matter stands. Are there any other questions? Final question, Mr. Brown?
So just one, what would be the message of the government of Trinidad and Tobago to citizens in Trinidad and Tobago, given our close proximity to both Venezuela and Guyana, and also, as you mentioned earlier, the presence of Trinidad and Tobago nationals in Guyana and Venezuela? What would be the message from the government to our citizens here and in Guyana and Venezuela following the meeting that occurred in St. Vincent yesterday between the presidents of Guyana and Venezuela?
Well, if there are, and there are, citizens of Trinidad and Tobago in Guyana and elsewhere in the region, they are citizens of Guyana in Trinidad and Tobago and elsewhere in the region, because we are one family. And my message to them is clear. You are an important part of the Caribbean community, and you can trust the reality that you have leadership at the head of this family that is focused on pragmatic solutions, that has been responding to challenges in the best way possible, and that continues to demonstrate the solidarity and the wisdom, the unity, and the wherewithal necessary to ensure that your families can achieve their fullest potential. So today, you are the beneficiary in an improved atmosphere a lifting of a sense of impending calamity, a reduction of tension at this time, and a formula to try to avoid a further escalation of tension. You are the benefits of the work of CARICOM, but maybe some of these same principles we as citizens can apply between ourselves to help reduce violence and tension in our respective societies.
Another question from me. The last thing I read about...
One more.
Yeah, just one more. The last thing I read, President Maduro had issued, state contracts in the Essequibo region. So I would like to know, following up from the meeting, has he, decided to pull back on that action?
No, there was no decision on the part of Venezuela to nullify any of the decrees that they would have handed down. What there was agreement, and again I have to take you back to paragraph 6, that from here on both states would refrain by word and by deed. So further words or further deeds from escalating any conflict and any disagreement arising from any controversy between them. That covers a wide acreage, and that formulation was very deliberate. Yes, I think we've gotten the signal. Thank you very much. Appreciate your presence. Best wishes to you and your families. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year.